Hi, and thank you for joining us here at Tax Talk UK, where we talk about all things tax and also consider other important aspects of working for yourself, running a small business, being self-employed. So today we're going to talk about selling things on eBay and the tax implications of this. And before I talk about that, if I could please ask you to take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you'll easily be able to refer back to this information if you should need to, as well as being able to navigate to other information that we have available on a whole host of different topics, all aimed at supporting you. So back then to eBay. So we've been asked a lot of variety of questions, but all boiling down to selling things on eBay and the tax implications. So the question, if you're selling things on eBay, is do you need to be aware of tax implications? Then absolutely yes, you do. So generally speaking, any kind of income that you receive from whatever source it may be is likely to have some sort of tax implication, even if it may be covered by some sort of exemption or something like that. It's really important, if you are receiving income from anywhere, to be sure that you understand the tax implications of that income and at what points you may need to notify somebody and at what points you may become liable for any tax. So selling things on eBay, of course, covers a wide range of different activities. So firstly, it's important to think, what are you selling and what are the implications of this? Which tax may you incur some liability for or need to invoke an exemption, for example? So when it comes to selling items on eBay then, so firstly, let's consider what you're selling it and in what capacity. So if you are selling your personal possessions, for example, then this would fall under the remit of capital gains tax, and that would be what you would need to be looking at. So your personal possessions is basically your stuff, things that belong to you, things that are your items to use, to wear accordingly. So if you are selling personal possessions and they are under £6,000, then the chances are that you won't need to pay capital gains tax. Now, if you do sell an item for over £6,000, then you would also need to then be aware of your annual allowance, i.e. the amount of capital gains that you can make before actually you do need to look at paying capital gains tax. So personal possessions under £6,000 generally won't be taxable. Now, it's important to mention, because when we talk about £6,000, automatically you're likely to think of your vehicles, your car, motorbike perhaps, and your house. Now, these are separate. So your personal vehicle is exempt. You don't need to pay capital gains tax on that. And your personal property, generally speaking, unless you've used it for business or had any rental income, you will be exempt. But obviously, if you're not sure about that, you do need to check the rules specific to that. But generally, we're talking about sort of smaller personal possessions. Now, it's important to mention that any personal possession that you have used for business, that does change things. But if you've not used things for business and you just decided, I don't need this anymore, I'm going to just sort of sell this on eBay, then it's capital gains tax that you would need to be aware of and check the rules for. But if it's under £6,000, it's unlikely that you would need to pay capital gains. I'm going to pop the link in the description for the capital gains on personal possessions, so that you can, if you're unsure about your personal situation and circumstances, that you can check that out in more detail. So so that's if you're selling them personal possessions on eBay. If you're selling items with a view to making a profit, regardless of whether you're buying them on eBay or elsewhere, then this is considered a business activity, and therefore it's income tax that you need to be aware of the rules for. Now, if you are just selling a small amount of items, one-off, or just sort of very sort of low value, then it's important to remember that this would fall under trading as a sole trader. And it's important to remember that if your turnover, your income from that source is under £1,000 within the year, then you would be exempt from needing to complete a self-assessment tax return and the tax on that. It's important to say that £1,000 is what you actually receive. So if you sell something for £1,200, but you bought it for £1,000, so the profit is only £200, then it's still the turnover is still over £1,000, so that exemption no longer applies. So if you are selling items on eBay with the purpose of making a profit, you've bought those items, they're not your personal possessions, you've bought them with the intention of making a profit, and you take over £1,000, then you need to be notifying HMRC of that income, and it would be subject to income tax. Now, what's really important to know is that regardless of whether you are liable to any tax on the money that you receive from eBay, it's important to know that there is communication between eBay and HMRC. So HMRC are likely to know what income that you've had. So it's important that you are clear of whether there is any tax implication and what exactly you are selling. Now, of course there are some grey areas as with everything, but one thing that we've been asked about is if you buy a personal possession but then you don't use it, perhaps you buy an item of clothing and it doesn't fit, or you buy something that then you find doesn't meet your requirements, and so therefore you sell it back on. You think, well, I bought this, I'm not going to waste it, I'm going to sell it back on, and you make a profit. Well, of course, if you're doing that on a regular basis, or sort of more than a one-off, then of course you are making a profit from that income. So it's important, therefore, that you understand exactly whether that would fall within the remit of income tax or capital gains. As I say, know the limits that would kick in, that would mean that you would have to start being liable for income tax and potentially national insurance if you're buying and selling and making a profit and your profit is over the threshold. So the short answer is that yes, if you are selling anything on eBay, you need to be aware of the tax implications. You need to be aware of what type of tax it may fall within the remit of. You need to know the exemptions and the allowances and whether that income is going to be taxable. If it is taxable, then you need to be notifying HMRC. Now, what's important to understand, particularly if you're buying and selling to make a profit, and you're not factoring in tax when you're deciding whether it's a viable source of income or a viable business opportunity, is that there is communication between eBay and HMRC, and HMRC can look respectively. So just because you get to the end of a tax year and you haven't heard from HMRC, even if you're confident that the income that you are receiving isn't taxable, it's really important that you keep the full record so that if HMRC ask you in the future, that you can provide evidence that that was not, there was no liability incurred. Perhaps if you bought some items to sell, but you ended up just selling them at cost and you couldn't make a profit, well, then you still need to be able to evidence the purchase to HMRC to verify that there was no profit, because otherwise HMRC will be looking at the money that you incurred, received from eBay, and they will be wanting you to demonstrate to them the basis that you think that that is not taxable income if you're confident. And of course, with everything, if you're not sure, if the rules are too complex for you to understand, which tax is complex, tax is it can be very confusing, it can be difficult to work out exactly where something fits in. So if you're not certain, then I would suggest getting some professional advice so that you are certain, because if, for example, you receive this income for a few years believing that it is exempt from tax for some reason, and then HMRC look respectively and they go back for several years, and you will then have to pay the tax long after you spent the money that you have. So it's just prudent to just at the time that you're having that income from eBay, that you are confident what you're selling, whether it's personal possessions falling more within the remit of capital gains, or intended to make a profit, which would fall within the remit of income tax and be more classified as a sole trader activity, that you are sure of whether you're meeting the allowances. And if you initially look at that and you are confident that you're under an allowance, just make sure that you monitor what's happening, because it can be sort of, quickly these things can build up, and before you know it, you've gone over a threshold. So for example, if you're selling items on eBay, perhaps if you've purchased them on eBay or purchased them at a car boot with an intention of selling those items on, if you have another source of income, perhaps you're employed and you have a PAYE job which utilizes all of your personal allowance, in that scenario, as soon as you take more than £1,000 of income, then you will be required to notify HMRC, and you will be liable for income tax on the profit. So again, just to recap, I know I've already covered it, but it's really important to keep your records of how much you spent on items initially, because if you are making a profit, it's only the profit that's taxable, and therefore you don't want to be having to pay tax on the full sale when that may not be applicable. And of course, in that scenario as well, it's important that you factor in any other costs, not just on that specific item, but anything covered in that activity. So for example, if you are going to a car boot sale, traveling there by car specifically to purchase items to sell on eBay at a profit, then of course the mileage of your car, for example, in that journey would be an allowable expense against the profit. So just as I say, I can't stress this important enough. It's really important that you understand which tax you need to be aware of, exactly how that fits with you and what you're doing. Make sure that you're aware of the allowances, make sure that you keep the records, even if you're under an allowance or an exemption applies, just keep the records so that if you are in the future asked about that by HMRC, you will be able to evidence to them that you were in fact eligible for an exemption under an allowance, and otherwise you could end up having to pay liability that actually you haven't really incurred. It's just that you can't demonstrate that you haven't incurred it. So not a straightforward answer, as rarely the answers are. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope this has helped you at least to understand what you need to be looking at. I will pop those links in the description. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.